Join James Tambalebi for Ask the Expert.
Hello and welcome to the program Ask the Expert with me, James Tambalebi. For today's program, we are looking at the topic toxicology, and I have as my expert Alhaji Yunjai, lecturer in biology and microbiology at FBC and Commerce, respectively. Toxicology is said to be a scientific discipline overlapping with biology, chemistry, pharmacology, and medicine that involves the study of the adverse effects of chemical substances on living organisms and the practice of diagnosing and treating exposures to toxins and toxicants. The relationship between those and its effects on the exposed organism is said to be of high significance in toxicology. But for an expert definition of the concept, I have as my expert, like I said, Professor Alhaji Yunjai, lecturer and scientist in the Department of Biological Sciences, Forabe College, and the Department of Microbiology at the College of Medicine and Allied Health Sciences, Free University of Sierra Leone. Professor Njai is a research fellow, University of Wisconsin-Madison, USA. Welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you for having me, as always.
Let's start with an expert definition of toxicology.
So, I think you've just mentioned what the definition of toxicology is. Toxicology is the study of adverse effects of chemicals, but also that are either natural or man-made substances, and then also that adverse effect is either the change from a normal state to something abnormal. And then it's also the study of the adverse effects of chemicals or natural or man-made on human or environment. So it impacts the environment, impacts humans also. And toxicology is a very multidisciplinary field. And when I say multidisciplinary, it means if you want to study toxicology, understand it, you need to know biology, chemistry, pharmacology, environmental science. You need to know, medicine. You need to know. At some point, I will go into the area of where it expands into even governance and politics and policies and all those kind of things. So it's very multidisciplinary, and it has a lot of things in it, and even economics at some point when it goes to risk management. But for now we'll just discuss some of the key fields that are associated with it.
So how can you underscore the importance of toxicology as a discipline?
So toxicology is so important. So when you think about our evolution as human beings, how we started establishing things that are good versus things that are bad. So for instance, plants. We started looking at plants that are edible, plants that are not edible. So many plants are toxic. They release toxic toxins. They can kill humans, they can kill other animals. So we began, even our own evolution as humans started with understanding the field of toxicology, the field of poisons. For instance, early on in our histories, we know that human beings have always used poisons against one another. And Socrates, for instance, he did something to youths, and he was sentenced to death, and he was given a hemlock poison. And Cleopatra, in the ancient histories, we know she used to use poisons to kill prisoners, and then she committed suicide by being bitten by a very poisonous snake. So she had a poisonous snake bite her, and then she committed suicide by that. But also, when you think of medicine, the field of medicine and making medicines evolved earlier from venomous plants and venomous animals. So you take poisons from frogs or from snakes, and then you use that to make painkillers. So toxicology as a field has a huge importance in our evolution, but also an importance in our everyday life. Because imagine, from the thing you are eating, the food you are eating, to what you are exposed to in the air, to what is in water, to the drugs you are taking, the medications you are taking, all have toxicology implications to it. In fact, when you make a drug, or in drug development or vaccine development, the major thing that kills the research and development of drugs is not the pharmacology, it's not the chemistry, it's not the biology. At the end of the day, 40% of the time, up to 50%, the drug development of a potential drug candidate is killed in the development because of toxicology. So if you take millions of dollars that goes into drug development that takes 10 years to develop, the most important criteria is toxicity toxicology. How does the drug or behave in humans when humans take it in? So, for instance, we've seen drugs like thalidomide. Thalidomide, it was given to women to solve morning sickness in women, but thalidomide proved to be a very toxic drug. It had side effects that causes birth defects in babies. It causes abnormalities in the fetus. So thalidomide has been banned in the market, right? And so toxicology accounts for a lot of things that gets recalled or banned in the market. Even cosmetic products, you have to look them for their toxicity. Food, I have to talk about that later. Food safety and food toxicity is one of the big things. In Sierra Leone, we don't address it much. We're just eating everything. But even the peanut you are eating, the granite, the corn, the rice, all have mold. They have fungus, and they create fungal toxins. And the aflatoxin in those funguses can cause cancer or liver damage. And in young babies, it actually causes stunted growth. So you have a lot of issues. And then you think about in the environment, you say Freetown, we have Bome, we have all these things that are around us, vehicle emissions, vehicles with just carbon monoxide and carbon being emitted, fossil fuel. And then you have all these waste dump areas, these hazardous substances. If you go to Kintom, you go to Bome, you go to all these places. Now, all of these have significant effect not just on organisms in the environment, but on us humans, because they can affect they can cause a lot of issues, from cancers to other reproductive health effects, which I will talk about later, and other health impacts.
So like you said, we'll come to that. Let's look at toxicity. What are the types of toxicity?
So when you talk about toxicity, it is very important because it is about dose. So in toxicology, we say every substance is toxic, as a toxicologist. So a toxicologist says every substance, anything is toxic. It is the dose that differentiates it from being a poison. So anything that you consume is toxic. Even water. Water is toxic.
So what's the threshold?
So water is about 6 liters. So water, the LD50 is about 6 liters. If you take over 6 liters of water, you end up having, issues. In fact, there is a lady who died from just drinking a lot of water. In the US, they have these games in which they will do these fraternities in which they will have, people take a lot of either water or drink alcohol, and then they ask, how much can you take, and the lady took as much water and ended up dying. And so
that's toxic.
That's toxic. Over a certain dose, over 6 liters of water at any given point in time, it's not good. Over 115 cups of coffee at any given point in time, it becomes toxic, right? And then if you take over 12 shots of alcohol, that is at 40%, is also the LD50s, like that, 12 shots. So you see there is an LD50, but you think of like most toxicities, you have what we call the acute toxicity. So for some things, when you are exposed to them, in a very high concentration, in a short amount of time, it can be highly toxic and can cause death. Other things, we call them chronic toxicity. Chronic toxicity is where you are exposed to that substance, but in a very small amount over a long period of time. And that is what we actually get exposed to. It's a lifetime of exposure. So you are exposed to a certain toxicant, but it is very small amount you are taking. And that small amount, you are doing that on a daily basis, over a period of your lifetime. And so as you're doing that, it accumulates. So it's called chronic toxicity, and those are the ones that lead to the chronic, some of the conditions like cancers, like the reproductive health effects. They are the ones that cause a lot of some of our issues like liver toxicity. They cause issues with kidneys, cause other challenges because it's over a long period of time. Either you are taking them through the air, or you are eating them having them in your diet, or you are exposed to them in your water, and so these are contaminants. So for instance, if you have just like a huge, like a one-time thing, a huge gas spill sometimes, that could be acute because people take it and you're acute. If you're exposed to cyanide, potassium cyanide is a systemic toxicity. It is very quick, it's a poison, and it kills very quick. So that's it can be very acute. While others forms of toxicity can also be less systemic, but they are more localized, more organ. So they target a specific organ. If you take alcohol a lot impacts your liver because you are processing the alcohol. So the liver enzyme, the alcohol dehydrogenase, converts the alcohol into a metabolite called acetaldehyde, and the acetaldehyde then can now begin to destroy your liver. Your liver starts to inflame.
You are listening to Ask the Expert with me, James Tambalebi, and we are talking on the topic toxicology, and I have as my expert Professor Alhaji Yunjai, a lecturer at Furabi College and Comas, University of Sierra Leone. So let's look at risk assessments and its implication for human health.
Yes, so risk assessment is very, very important. So in toxicology, there is a lot of work that goes into the research end of things, understanding hazardous substances, identifying them, what is a very dangerous substance in terms of our human health, in terms of our environmental health. So you call them the hazardous substances. You know them. You kind of look for, the dioxins. You look for the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, smoke. You look for things, oil, pollution. You look for drugs. You look for different types of things, toxins, plant toxins or animal toxins. You look for them. Those are just the hazards. When you are doing risk assessment, looking at the hazards alone is not enough. You have to look at the dose of those hazards. How much of it are we exposed to? So, for instance, you want to know how much of the cyanide kills a human being. So, not just the cyanide as being a poison, but how much of it as a dose then affects a human. How much of alcohol does affect a human. So then, when you do risk assessment, you are looking at the hazard versus the exposure. That is, how again are we exposed to it? So when you take the hazard versus the exposure, then it equals your risk. So sometimes something could be of a high hazard, but my exposure to it is very low. So you don't have to worry. So when I say risk assessment, is to look at what is the risk to humans of this thing being around here. For instance, I'll give an example. If you have a lion roaming around is a hazard. You know it's a dangerous animal. It is very dangerous. So if the lion is just roaming around, so you have a hazard and it's roaming around freely, your exposure to it is very high. your likelihood of being attacked by that lion is high. So your risk of being attacked by the lion is high. If the lion is, you have a lion in your environment, but the lion is in a cage, so you have a hazard, but your exposure to it is low because it is in a cage. So your risk then becomes low. So that's how we tend to then walk around the field of toxicology on how we look at exposure versus the hazard. So the hazard may be there, but if your exposure is not high or exposure is very low, it can impact your risk.
So let's look at the nexus between environmental pollution from places like Bome and Kintom, like you mentioned earlier, and toxicity.
Yes. So one of the things in environmental health is that if you have chemicals in Bome, like in Bome, in Kintom, in those areas, so chemicals have various properties. When you have a chemical, depending on the physical chemical properties of that chemical, the chemical can partition into the air. We call it volatilization. So if the chemical is highly volatile, that means it likes to be in the gas phase. So you have three states: solid, liquid, gas. So if the chemical partitions and it wants to be more in the gas phase, it means it's in the air more. So people around Bome, in Kintom, or even around Freetown will be breathing in. You'll be breathing in this chemical because you dump it, but it doesn't stay in the dump. It's going up in the air. And so in the air now, around that area, so anyone who lives around Kintom, Bome area, they have the higher concentration because they are close by. And then if you further out, it may be diluted because of the air movement. Then the other aspect is, there are other chemicals that partition into the water. So they will go down into the water rather than go up, because they want to partition. They are heavier. They want to be in water than in air. So that partition coefficient then makes those ones in water. So what does that mean? It means that these chemicals can get into the water system. And so if you have a well in that area, you have a likelihood of drinking water that is contaminated with these chemicals. And then there are others that can partition into plants, or they can partition into suspension of, in that area. So if you take in like things like fish, the fish gets contaminated because they are taking in some of the suspended chemicals. And you find, so the partitioning happens all over, and in places like that in Bome there is high exposure risk.
So which of those partitions are lethal for human consumption?
Actually most of them. So if it's in the air or in the soil, if people are playing around with the soil, or if it's water, because you are also taking in. So if you're taking, water from the area, the water is contaminated, it's going into your system. And so particularly some of the compounds that are there, they are called dioxins, and some of the dioxins or TCDD that may be in Bome, some of the compounds, they are very hazardous. They are called non-biodegradable. It means that they cannot be degraded by microbes. So what happens? Because they are not degraded by microbes, if they get into the water, or they get into the to the airstream, and those chemicals, if those chemicals end up in humans, what happens is that they find their way into the fat areas of humans. So there is a danger of some of those chemicals, the heavy chemicals. They tend to want to partition, those ones that want to partition into soil, or they want to partition into water. If those ones end up in human systems, if humans get into those chemicals, they end up getting into your fat. And if they are in the fat, they will stay there for a long period of time because your body cannot degrade them.
Perhaps finally, how can we ensure enhancement of food security, microtoxins, and health?
Yes, it's very important. So everything we are exposed to, food, whether it's food, whether it's water, whether it's environment, whether it's chemicals, there is a danger because there is a certain level of toxicity involved. So we eat food every day in Sierra Leone. We don't think about the aspect of toxins, food toxin. So a lot of the diseases that people come down with, that we go to the hospital here and you're diagnosed sometimes as malaria or typhoid, it's actually a food poisoning, right? You have been because every time you expose that rice, or you leave the rice from night in the morning, you eat cold rice, we call it cold rice in the morning, you may have exposed that food to bacterial toxins. You may also, in drinking water, in Freetown, a lot of drinking water is contaminated with E. coli. You have a lot of fecal coliform bacteria that then causes a lot of issues with diarrhea, issues with food toxicity in people. And then you have salmonella. We buy meat all the time, meat that is grilled. You are buying your suya, you are buying stuff, it's not properly done. Somebody has may have not done a lot of poor hygiene or sanitation, may have gone to the restroom, they contaminate that with it's contaminated with some salmonella. And then you also have issues around the mycotoxins like aflatoxin. Aflatoxin is in mold. You find a lot of mold on rice, corn, cassava. A lot of our food crops get mold, and this mold, if you have it in large quantities, it can cause acute toxicity, especially for young children. Aflatoxicosis is very bad for young children, because for young children it causes stunted growth, retards their development, and it causes liver damage and then leads to liver cancer for young children. And for older people, over a long period of time of being exposed to aflatoxins in our food, which is very common here, leads to cancer. So a lot of the cancers you see in Sierra Leone, the hepatic cancers, is a mix between either you have hepatitis or you have aflatoxin, and we don't do screening for aflatoxin a lot, in the country. And also, it's very important when we look at water quality, the water we are drinking. A lot of the times, we have water that is very acidic. So when you have water that has high levels of acidity, nitrate and sulfate, say for instance, somebody is doing agriculture in the area, they're applying fertilizers, sulfates and nitrates, and those fertilizers end up in the drinking water. They go down into the water systems, and then they go into to the well systems in communities. When they go into the well systems, like what there's a study that I've just looked at in Pepel, in Pepel here in Port Loko. Much of the community water system is contaminated with nitrates and sulfates, and those nitrates and sulfates go in, make the water acidic, so it then releases iron. So you get a lot of instead of iron being bound to the soil, because of the acidity, so iron 3 now becomes breaks up, so the iron becomes released into the water, so you get iron toxicity. So there's a lot of issues around those kind of toxic issues in the country.
Prof, we will talk on and on and on this very important topic, but I would like us to bring the curtain down on this topic because of time.
Yes.
And we'll continue the discussion further. You've been listening to Ask the Expert with me, James Tambalebi, and we've been talking on the topic toxicology. I have as my experts Professor Alhaji Yunjai, lecturer and scientist in the Department of Biological Sciences, Forabe College, and the Department of Microbiology at the College of Medicine and Allied Health Sciences, Commerce, University of Sierra Leone. Professor Njai is also a research fellow, University of Wisconsin, Madison, United States of America. Keep listening.
Tune into Radio Mount Earl, FM 107.3, every Monday after the 8 p.m. news bulletin, and on Saturdays after the 7 a.m. news bulletin for Ask the Expert.